The importance of Palestinians telling their own stories of what happened to them in 1948, which everybody refers to as Al-Nakba, or the catastrophe, is that it's never been done, and it's such an important collective experience that it deserves to be put down and preserved so that subsequent generations can understand what happened. I think the whole question of Palestinian history and Palestinian identity has been central to our experience as a people, which is quite unusual. Most people in their history are not challenged as to their existence. I mean, did you or did you not exist? I mean, I'm old enough to remember Golda Meir in 1969 saying there are no Palestinians, they don't exist as a people. So and of course, a lot of what happened in Palestine in 1948 and before was premised on not just the disappearance of the Palestinians, but the absence of the Palestinians. So I think for Palestinians, the whole question of identity and the affirmation of identity and the whole question of the continuity of this identity is especially important, because our enemy has tried always to either to silence or make us absent, physically, by driving people away, and in their own official narrative. So the existence of a Palestinian narrative, compiled and fashioned by Palestinians, is a form of, you might say, positive proof of a national existence and a national identity.
It was just Israel at 50. It wasn't the Palestinians at 50. No, because that was the anniversary that was completely forgotten. It was, and to the extent that it did come in, was, oh, here's this thing on the side that's also going on, as though it somehow wasn't integral to the story. And I think that's why there was such a feeling that something had to be done to bring it to the forefront.
It's interesting that you bring this about, because the irony is, for Palestinians, this historical event is the Nakba, the catastrophe, and that's when 2/3 of the Palestinian population was expelled from Palestine and was scattered in the diaspora.
It's not called Lid anymore. It's the Israelis, after 1948, they renamed the villages or the cities, and now it's called Lud. It's right here.
Actually, Lod and Olidda and Ramla, which is the town next to it, were two major Palestinian cities, and about 50,000 Palestinians were expelled from them in 1948. My mother is from a village called Lifta, which was near Jerusalem, and if you look at this modern Israeli tourist map of Jerusalem, you'll see that it shows Jerusalem, and here, this is exactly where Lifta was, and it's now just shown as a green space in a park.
So there's nothing left?
Well, there's ruins, and when I went there, I saw the ruins, and there's also a sign which says it's a nature reserve now. And there are dozens of Palestinian villages like that all over the country that have become forests or nature reserves, or they've built over them and erased even the physical remnants of the villages.
And unfortunately, the life which we enjoyed in Jaffa did not continue. It ended with the 48 disaster.
It was unthinkable, unbelievable, unexpected, and it shouldn't have happened. The mere fact that you went from one place to another was a strenuous experience. Now let's shift to 48, when those people had to leave or forced to leave, and now they are leaving to somewhere unknown. So the trauma, instead of being a strenuous experience, it now became a trauma.
We fled because of the war. I mean, who wants to stay and kill or be killed? We were a nation of farmers. We were a nation of middle-class people, teachers, landowners, businessmen. We were not there to fight a war. The war started and we were caught in the middle of it. and we packed our a little bit of our gear for a short trip outside until things settled down. We covered the furniture that we had. We locked the door and took the key. We still have the key.
All we saw was shooting, and they said, "The Jews came, the Jews came." I was worried about my children. They were young, and I hid them under the beds to protect them. It was hot that day, as if the earth were on fire.
طول النهار ضلوا الناس ماشيين يمشوا يمشوا طول النهار نهار صحيح.
People walked all day, from morning till night.
بدري لليل هم يمشوا. الله يساعدهم مسكينين. الله يساعدهم مسكينين. معهم طفل.
God help them. They had children. They came with nothing. They only came with what they were wearing.
ولا إشي ما معهم. غير أواعيهم اللي لابسينهن. بعدين مسكينين وين بدهم يروحوا؟ قلنا لهم
Poor souls, they had nowhere else to go.
قطعوا شجر وسووا عرس بترومنا وقعدوا في العريشات.
So we offered them our orchards to stay in.
يعني شو العرس؟
They built huts in our orchards. We offered them what we had: grapes, figs, and pomegranates.
وهي العنا يعني احنا بنقدر نساعدهم فيه هذا.
لما اجوا اللاجئين عنا الحمد لله احترمناهم ما قصرناش فيهم.
When the refugees came to our village, we did not deny them anything.
يعني مش احنا بس كل اهل البلد.
Whatever we had, we shared with them. The whole village helped them.
قعدوا اللي عنده
Those who had houses took them in, and those with no room let them stay in their orchards.
مش اعطيناهم كل شيء.
My dad and the rest of the family, they went to the seashore, they took a boat, and they went to Kira, Lebanon, Sur. So this is how they fled Jaffa, because there was no way for them to sit under bullets and all nights. They went to Lebanon. There was no communication whatsoever for about 3-month period. We had no idea where they went, what happened to them. And we started sending messages in the radio, you know, that we are in Bethlehem, tell us if you are alive, where you at, blah, blah, blah. Until about 3 months from that, somebody was coming from Lebanon somehow, and he told us that they are alive. So we start sending a letter through the Red Cross to give them a message, you know, about where we are, what we are doing. But it was a period of hectic period, so to speak, not to know what happened to the whole family.
Why do you think Palestinians, when they remember the story of 1948, they remember it as a collective story, as opposed to remembering the story of the individual?
The remembering as a collective experience, because it was collective, i.e. when people were forced out of their towns, of their villages, of their huts, or their whatever, wherever they lived, they were forced out as a group, not as individuals. It wasn't one person running away. It was a whole mess of people. There may have been some remembrances of individual things, like a lady having a baby, and it did happen, or a woman having lost her child, which did happen, or a man falling sick, and did happen, or a man carrying his 3 children on his back and then not being able to do it, just exhausted. There was no way of him to be able to continue. There are these individual experiences within the collective, but these individual experiences, although to the individual, they are very severe, very traumatic, very personal, yet they somehow are diminished within the total picture of these hordes of people moving to an unknown destination.
This recent interview that I did, this woman really struck me, and just by what she was saying, she kept insisting that her story is insignificant, and she kept asking me questions like, what difference is this going to make to us? How is this going to change our status right now, living in Chicago, and how is it going to change the status of Palestinians in general? So, I mean, what really bothered me is that she kept insisting that her story is insignificant, and it's not relevant anymore.
Listening to you talk this way, it's occurred to me that there's some similarities with, for instance, my mother's story, which is completely different. My mother grew up in Germany, Jewish, and she and her sister were actually sent out in '38, so they were there through the Nazi period. It's incredibly hard for my mother to talk about that period. She tells stories about perfectly ordinary stories, normal stories from the period before the Nazis. But she doesn't have anything to say about persecution. She sort of got apprenticed as a kind of scullery maid or something to this guy who ran a kind of informal restaurant or something, and all she'll talk about is how she had to chop onions, and her hands smelled of onions. Like, that's the only story of persecution. It's not a story of persecution, chopping onions. But that's it, and maybe that's something of what these interviewees are going through. I mean, they have maybe some little tiny personal experience, but it doesn't seem important, and it's painful enough, let alone something life-threatening.
Maybe when you're doing the interviews, ask the questions in a way which brings them back to their lives at that moment, and maybe things that have nothing to do with the catastrophe that happened. Like, ask them to remember important days, like what was it like when they celebrated feasts, Eids, or weddings? How did they prepare? What were they doing? Did they have a role? And try to remember the rhythms of life. And then the Nakba comes along as such a disruption, such a catastrophic disruption, that then maybe that will then take them into some of these things that you're trying to find out about.
Going to school in the morning, going to the beach in the afternoon, swim, and catch few fish and eat them, roast them right sometime on the beach, or just in the coffee house where we used to sit. And it was a life of peaceful life. It never would be replaced.
People spend their time in the fields or something related to their crops. In general, very close-knit community. People cared about each other. People helped each other, interacted very frequently and very intimately with each other, came to the help of each other. A lot of communal things were done together, especially at harvest time, for example. That's one place where people do jump to help each other. The crop has to be harvested at a certain time, otherwise you lose it, therefore everybody comes and helps. Social occasions were another time for intimate contacts. Weddings is one place. Certainly burials is an elaborate ceremony, as well as an elaborate and intimate interconnections and social contact with each other. Doesn't matter who is the dead person, everybody walks in the funeral. Prior to anybody thinking about formal training, the militias themselves had no training whatsoever. The rest of us never saw a gun, in many cases. Under the British, if you were rumored to have been at a place where a gun was shown or a gun was there, that was a high crime. If you were convicted of owning one, that was death penalty. So this is a kind of militia that defended its own turf, its own towns. People simply joined together. It was traumatic, to put it simply, and this is an understatement actually, considering that I'm talking about myself, and I suspect it applies to a lot of others too. I think there was a high degree of innocence and naivete on my part.
ستي هذا انت لما كنت بالبلاد كنت ترزيه قلتي للفريندز مش هيك لمدرسة الفريندز؟
هذا كان بيت
I used to knit this and sell it in Ramallah.
اشتغل وابيعه تيجي وحده مرة
Women used to come and buy this.
بنات بالفريندز معلمات يعني اوادم ناس اوادم.
Later, I met some teachers from the Quaker Friend School who bought my crochet and helped me sell it to others. They were very kind to me.
يشتروا مني وتساعدني حرام كثير مناح كانوا ولا الاولاد هذول ايش رباهم.
Who do you think raised the children?
طلعنا ولا شيء ما معنا على الارض طلعنا.
We left with nothing.
كانوا في القصة المحصورين مدة أقل شيء 20 يوم 15 بدون.
They were under siege in the Qastal for at least 15 to 20 days, without food or clothes. When we received this news, we sent them aid.
Palestinian defeat? There was no such thing as a Palestinian defeat. It was a total disaster of the whole Arab world. How did we meet that defeat? With a lot of bitterness. We never gave up that somehow we will never go back. So there was a lot of misinformation, a lot of broken promises. And the Palestinians never got together in order to do something about it. We were scattered and spread every which way. We were scattered in Egypt, we were scattered in Jordan, we were scattered in Lebanon, in Syria, some in Iraq, some in Kuwait, some in remaining in Palestine. There was no cohesive force to get us together until the 60s when the Palestinian movement came about.
So there was a sense of having failed in the sense of being responsible for that failure. And not knowing exactly what was the reason for that failure or where you have failed. And I did go through a period of depression. You know, we hear a lot about the Vietnam syndrome and this syndrome and the other syndrome. So I think there was a syndrome there too. Fortunately, it didn't last too long. We had to pull ourselves out of it. There was no conscious endeavor on the part of the totality to pull out or anybody talking about it, about the need to address the syndrome, quote unquote. No, I think each one of us handled himself by himself separately.
For a while we were emotionally devastated, and then we were hopeful, and then devastated, and hopeful, and devastated, like everybody else, you know. You get anesthetized after a while, that when there is something hopeful, you don't really attach yourself to it because you don't want the disappointment of losing it. This has happened over and over and over and over again.
Asking whether people resisted or not made me realize that resistance could take a different form and different shape. What resistance meant for me was so different when I resisted the Intifada than what those people experienced in 1948.
I wonder if it makes a difference in the way people tell the story if they're living in Palestine or in the Middle East as opposed to living in exile here in the United States. I wonder what that becoming exiled has, if it's affected how people tell the story or don't tell it.
I probably can answer that, Adi, because I was working in the summertime. I went to Palestine. I went back home, and I was working in an oral history project on also 1948, and we interviewed a lot of, 48 survivors And since I continued working on oral history projects here in Chicago, interviewing Palestinian survivors of 48, there was interesting points when I think about it between how people told their stories, the people in Palestine, 48 survivor in Palestine, and the people here in Chicago. And I've noticed a lot of interesting things, like people here felt very hesitant, or most of them felt very hesitant telling their story, but on the other hand, people back home in Palestine, they were, like, we would walk on, in a refugee camp, let's say the Haisha camp, around the Bethlehem area, people would just grab us from the streets if they know that we're doing a project on 48. They would grab us from the street, they want to tell us their story. When you think about the West, people here, earlier I mentioned that some people are reluctant on telling their story, and they kept saying, we're not political. I mean, part of this is because just how the West documented this history. I mean, the story tend to be inaccurate, exaggerated, or untrue. So people thought of their history as not an ideal history. It's all about defeat, and that was part of why they were having a hard time or reluctant telling their personal stories.
I think a big difference is the context people live in here. I mean, this is a country that has really denied that ever happened to the Palestinians. This is a country that glorifies 1948, as we looked at, as something wonderful. So how, as a Palestinian, how do you live in this country when your story is not known, is even denied? So I think that really affects how people talk about it. The other thing is that when Palestinians do get active in this country, they're harassed by the FBI and things like that. So that would probably explain why somebody said, I'm not political, as if telling his own life story could put him in prison. But that's in fact happened in a certain way in this country. And also the climate here, as you see, it's growing, of the anti-Arab media we have here. I mean, not only does our government support policies that deny Palestinian rights, but our media is so anti-Arab, and it really hurts the children growing up here, the American-born generation, because, I mean, on the one hand they're Americans, and on the other hand their country of birth degrades their heritage.
It's only until much later that I came to peace with this confusion of identity. There was no home for me that I could call my own, regardless of where I was. I would meet with Palestinians, and the Palestinian friends would say, you're a traitor, you're becoming Lebanese. And I would meet with the Lebanese, and they say, you're still a Palestinian. I was neither here nor there. Because we are product of a Nakba, we have to excel better than everybody else. We have to become the professionals. We have to study hard. We have to work. We have to do this. The stereotype that we live in here, is amazing. The moment you mention Palestinian, they have ideas of either a Bedouin or a peasant or a terrorist. It took me the longest time so that when people ask me, what are you? I said, the hell with them all. I am a Palestinian. Look at me and judge me for what I am, not for what the stereotype of the papers mention. And I don't even tell them whether I'm Muslim or Christian. I'm a Palestinian. I'm an Arab.
Being born and raised in the States, it's very hard for us to even think about the kind of life they had.
Palestinian politics today are led by people who, in effect, have made a deal with the Israelis and the Americans to forget officially and renounce what happened to them in 1948 and beyond. And I take the view that all of Palestinian history since 1948 is a consequence of 1948. And so given the political fact that this history was given up just to have, people remain in power, then it becomes doubly important for the younger generations of Palestinians to say, look, I mean, that's not the full story. We want the full story. And our story effectively begins in the modern period with the Nakba, with the experiences of 1948, and therefore we must get the story right so that there can be no amnesia, there can be no self-mutilation, which is what has happened. And the only way we can restore ourselves as a people is to have our history. And I think the notion of reclamation is central to this process, to reclaim what has been taken away from us, both by our leaders and by the Israelis.
We hope this project will inspire Arab Americans to collect and preserve the stories and the experiences of the Nakba for the subsequent generations, because these stories and experiences will help us document a history and a narrative that hasn't received adequate attention.
Number one, they're very proud to be included in such a film. Number two, this is their way of preserving their knowledge, their memories of the past. They're very honored that somebody's even listening to their stories. Oral history is always something that fascinates people. And when you can hear something like this firsthand, and to hear the experiences of individuals that you've known and that raised you, that grew up with you, people that you're very familiar with, it makes it so much more meaningful. And a lot of times the history books and news accounts don't take into account the human suffering, the human feelings of the people that live through these times. So this makes it very meaningful, and it gives us a lot of insight into the lives of these people and the hardships and the happiness that they experienced.